You meet someone who feels like home. The connection is undeniable. The chemistry is real. And for the first time in a long time, you let yourself imagine what it would be like to actually be with someone. And then, without warning, you sabotage it. You pull away. You pick fights. You ghost. You find reasons why it won't work. You tell yourself you're protecting yourself from getting hurt. You say you're not ready. The timing's wrong. You need to work on yourself first. But here's what you won't admit. You're not running from the possibility of being hurt. You're running from the possibility of being seen. We've built an entire cultural narrative around the fear of loneliness. Endless movies, songs, books, and advice columns tell you that what you're really afraid of is ending up alone. That your relationship anxiety, your sabotage patterns, your inability to commit, all of it comes from a deep terror of being unloved and unwanted. And that narrative makes sense. It's sympathetic. It's understandable. It's something people can relate to and offer comfort around. Nobody judges you for being afraid of loneliness. They nod. They understand. They tell you you'll find someone. But that narrative is covering up something much darker. Something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. You're not afraid of being alone. You're afraid of being known. And there's a massive difference between those two fears that determines whether you'll ever actually connect with another human being or spend your life building walls disguised as boundaries. Loneliness is the fear of absence, of having no one, of being left, of existing without connection. And yes, loneliness hurts, but it's a survivable hurt. A manageable hurt. You know how to be alone. You've done it before. Your brain understands the parameters of that pain. Intimacy is the terror of presence, of being fully seen by another person, of letting someone past your defenses, of existing without the masks you've spent years perfecting. And that terror isn't about what happens if they leave. It's about what happens if they stay and see who you actually are underneath everything you pretend to be. This is the fear most people never name, because naming it means admitting something you don't want to admit. You've been hiding. And you've gotten so good at hiding that you've convinced yourself the masks are your real face, that the defenses are just healthy boundaries, that the walls are necessary protection. Jessica had this realization after her third failed relationship in 5 years. Each relationship followed the same pattern: intense connection at first, then a slow pulling away, then finding reasons to end it right when things got serious. She told herself she had commitment issues, that she was afraid of being trapped, that she valued her independence. But in therapy, she had to face a different truth. The moment someone got close enough to see her without her performance, the moment they started asking real questions about who she was beneath the impressive career and the fun personality and the together exterior, she panicked. And that panic had nothing to do with losing her freedom. It was about losing control of how she was perceived.
This is the visibility panic, when someone gets close enough to see past your carefully managed image. Your nervous system reads this as a threat, not because they might leave, but because they might stay and know you. And being known, actually known, feels more dangerous than being alone ever could. Because here's what your brain doesn't want you to realize. You can control loneliness. You can manage absence. You can predict and prepare for abandonment. But you can't control what someone sees when they actually look at you. And that loss of control over your own image is what triggers the sabotage. Think about the last time you pushed someone away right when things were getting real. Your logical brain probably told you a story about why the relationship wasn't right, why the timing was off, why they weren't the person for you. But underneath that story, there was a moment, a specific moment, when they saw something you didn't want them to see. Maybe they called you out on something you were pretending about yourself. Maybe they asked a question that required you to be honest instead of impressive. Maybe they just looked at you with enough familiarity that you couldn't maintain the performance anymore. And in that moment, you didn't feel afraid of losing them. You felt afraid of them staying and continuing to see. Marcus realized this about himself at 37 after spending 15 years in relationships that never made it past 2 years. He thought he had bad luck with timing, that he just hadn't met the right person, that he was too focused on his career to commit. But the truth was simpler and darker. Every time a woman got close enough to see his insecurities, his fears, his actual self beneath the confident exterior, he found a reason to leave before she could decide he wasn't enough. He wasn't afraid she would leave him. He was afraid she would see him and choose to stay anyway, which would force him to exist in a relationship without his armor, without his performance, without the version of himself he'd carefully constructed to be acceptable. And that felt impossible. This is the exposure paradox. The closeness you say you want is the exact thing that activates your deepest terror. Being fully visible to another person without the ability to control what they see or how they perceive you. So you sabotage connection before it reaches the depth where real visibility becomes unavoidable. And here's where it gets really dark. Most people prefer loneliness to visibility because loneliness lets you keep your illusions intact. When you're alone, you can believe whatever you want about who you are. You can maintain the image, perfect the performance, tell yourself the right person just hasn't come along yet. But intimacy destroys illusions. Real connection requires you to be seen as you actually are, which means confronting the gap between who you pretend to be and who you actually are. And for most people, that gap is so terrifying to acknowledge that they'd rather stay alone than face it. Sarah spent 10 years claiming she was too independent for a serious relationship. She dated casually, kept things surface level, and told herself she just hadn't met anyone who respected her need for space. But the truth she couldn't admit was that she was terrified of someone getting close enough to discover that beneath her independent exterior was someone who felt deeply inadequate and was convinced that if anyone really knew her, they'd see she wasn't as together as she appeared.
Her independence wasn't a preference, it was a defense. And every time someone tried to get closer, every time they wanted to know her beyond the surface, she felt that old panic. What if they see who I actually am and realize I'm not who I've been pretending to be? What if the real me isn't enough. This is the adequacy fear that lives underneath the fear of visibility. You're not just afraid of being seen, you're afraid of being seen and found lacking. Afraid that your actual self, the one beneath the performance, isn't worthy of love. So you keep people at the exact distance where they can see the version of you that you've decided is acceptable, but never close enough to see anything else. And your brain has become incredibly sophisticated at creating reasons to maintain that distance. You call it boundaries when it's actually walls. You call it standards when it's actually defense mechanisms. You call it being selective when it's actually being terrified of selection, of someone seeing you clearly and having to choose whether your real self is enough. But here's what changes everything. The distance that protects you from being seen also prevents you from being known. And being known, actually known, without performance or pretense, is the only thing that ever creates genuine connection. Which means the very mechanism you use to protect yourself from rejection guarantees you'll never experience real acceptance. Because acceptance without visibility isn't real. If someone accepts the version of you that you're performing, they're not accepting you, they're accepting your mask. And you can feel the difference, which is why even in relationships, you still feel alone. You're not lonely because you're by yourself. You're lonely because even when someone is with you, they're not with the actual you. Elena realized this after 3 years of marriage. Her husband loved her, she had no doubt about that, but she felt profoundly alone in the relationship because he loved the version of her that she showed him. The easygoing wife, the supportive partner, the woman who had her life together. He didn't know about her anxieties, her doubts, her fears, the parts of herself she considered too messy or needy to reveal. She'd hidden those parts before they got married, thinking she was being smart, protecting the relationship from her problems. But now she was trapped, afraid that if she showed him who she actually was, he might not love that version. So she was technically in a relationship, but existentially alone, performing being a wife to someone who didn't actually know his wife. This is the intimacy illusion that most relationships operate under. Two people performing acceptable versions of themselves for each other, both feeling alone, but neither able to admit it, because admitting it would require the vulnerability of showing their actual selves. So they stay together and stay lonely, preferring the illusion of connection to the risk of real visibility. And the longer you maintain the illusion, the more terrifying it becomes to drop it. Because now, it's not just about being seen, it's about being seen after years of hiding. It's about admitting that the person you've been with doesn't actually know you. It's about facing the possibility that if they did know you, everything would change. So you keep hiding. You maintain the performance. You tell yourself the relationship is good enough, that total honesty would just create problems, that some things are better left private. And maybe you're right. Maybe revealing yourself would change everything. But here's the question that matters. Is it better to be in a relationship where you're not actually known, or to be alone and at least honest about it?
Most people choose the first option without realizing they're choosing at all. They drift through relationships feeling vaguely disconnected, wondering why, even with someone, they still feel alone, never connecting the dots that the loneliness comes from the hiding, not from the other person's inability to see them. Because here's what your brain doesn't want you to understand. People can't see what you won't show. If you feel unseen in your relationships, the question isn't why others don't see you, it's what you're actively hiding. And most people are hiding so much that they've forgotten the hiding is even happening. David went to couples therapy, convinced his wife didn't understand him. He felt invisible in the relationship, like she never really saw who he was. But through therapy, he had to face an uncomfortable truth he'd never shown her. Every time she asked him how he really felt, he gave her the acceptable answer. Every time she tried to get closer, he deflected with humor or changed the subject. He'd been performing being fine, being stable, being the provider, being the rock. And she believed the performance because that's what he wanted her to believe. But now he resented her for not seeing through it, for not knowing him without him having to do the terrifying work of being known. This is the resentment trap. You hide yourself, then resent others for not seeing you. You perform being acceptable, then feel angry that you're not loved for who you actually are. You maintain walls, then feel hurt that no one gets close enough to breach them. And all of it protects you from facing the real terror, choosing to be visible. Because visibility is a choice. Every moment of every day, in every interaction, you choose how much of yourself to reveal. And most people, most of the time, choose to reveal only what they believe is acceptable. The rest gets hidden, protected, defended, supposedly from others' judgment, but really from your own fear of what that judgment might confirm about you. But here's the truth that saves you, if you're brave enough to face it. The parts of yourself you're hiding aren't as unacceptable as you think they are. The fear isn't proportional to the reality. You're protecting yourself from a rejection that exists more in your imagination than in the actual responses of people who might actually see you. Rachel finally tested this after years of hiding her anxiety from everyone in her life. She was convinced that if people knew how much she struggled, they'd see her as weak, broken, too much to deal with. So she performed being fine, while privately drowning, until one day, exhausted from the performance, she told her best friend the truth about what she'd been hiding. And her friend's response wasn't judgment or rejection. It was relief. Relief that Rachel was finally being real. Relief that the friendship could now be about actual connection instead of performance. Relief that she wasn't the only one who struggled. The acceptance Rachel experienced in that moment, acceptance of her actual self, not her performed self, felt completely different from any validation she'd received for her mask. This is what real intimacy feels like, being known and accepted simultaneously. And the reason it feels so rare is because most people never take the risk required to experience it. They stay hidden, convinced that visibility equals rejection, never testing whether that belief is actually true.
But the cost of staying hidden is that you never get to experience being chosen for who you actually are. You only experience being chosen for who you pretend to be, which always feels hollow, always feels conditional, always leaves you wondering if they'd still choose you if they knew the truth. And that wondering, that constant anxiety about whether you're acceptable, is far more painful than loneliness ever could be, because loneliness is clean. You're alone, you know you're alone, you deal with it. But hidden loneliness, the loneliness of being with someone who doesn't actually know you, is its own special kind of suffering. So what does it actually take to move from hiding to visibility? What does it require to face the fear of being known instead of continuing to manage the fear of being alone? It requires accepting that visibility comes with risk. Real risk. The risk that someone might see you and not like what they see. The risk that being known might lead to rejection. The risk that your actual self might not be enough for some people. These risks are real, and pretending they're not doesn't help. But here's what also needs to be said. The alternative? Spending your life hiding, performing, maintaining walls, and calling it protection guarantees the very outcome you're trying to avoid. You won't be rejected, but you also won't be accepted. You won't be abandoned, but you also won't be truly connected. You'll be safe from the pain of being seen and judged inadequate, but you'll also be cut off from the experience of being seen and chosen anyway.
Alex finally understood this at 42, after decades of keeping people at arm's length and wondering why relationships never felt real. He realized he'd been so focused on protecting himself from the pain of rejection that he'd protected himself from everything else too. From genuine connection, from being truly chosen, from the experience of someone loving his actual self instead of his performance. And when he finally started taking the risk of being visible, sharing the parts of himself he'd always hidden, being honest about his fears and insecurities, dropping the mask he'd worn for so long, some people did pull away. He was right about that risk, but others got closer. And those connections, the ones based on his actual self instead of his performed self, felt more real than anything he'd experienced in decades of hiding. This is the trade you have to make. Give up control over how you're perceived in exchange for the possibility of being genuinely known. Stop managing your image in exchange for authentic connection. Risk rejection of your real self instead of continuing to receive hollow acceptance of your false self. And here's the final truth. You think you're afraid of being alone, but loneliness has never been the real threat. You've survived loneliness. You know that pain. What you haven't survived is visibility, being fully seen, fully known, fully exposed without your defenses. That's the terror you've been running from your whole life. So the question isn't whether you can handle being alone. The question is whether you're brave enough to let someone stay close enough to see who you actually are beneath everything you've been pretending to be. Because the fear of being alone will keep you performing forever, building walls disguised as boundaries, maintaining distance and calling it independence, hiding behind masks and wondering why you feel so disconnected even when you're with someone. But the courage to be visible, to risk being seen and chosen, or seen and rejected, but at least seen, that's what leads to the connection you've been claiming you want. The loneliness you can survive. The question is whether you can survive being known, and whether you'll ever give anyone the chance to actually try.